Hello, friends. Welcome once again to the Perfect Bound podcast. This is a podcast all about anything and everything comic books and comics related, brought to you by the Panel Jumper. My name is Ben. With me, as always, is Chris Casso.
Hello.
Cole Hornaday.
Hey there.
And joining us all the way from Salem, Massachusetts, he's an artist, a writer, and a letterer, Kurt Ankeny. Thanks for joining us, Kurt.
Hey, well, my pleasure.
And Cole, I'm gonna throw the rest of the intro over to you. Tell us who Kurt is.
Well, I have to be completely and utterly transparent. Kurt is probably one of my oldest friends. We met when he was an undergraduate and I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was not one of my students. He was a student of my then girlfriend, and she was really, really taken with him because he had done a final, I believe, Kurt, correct me, but I believe it was a final English project entirely in graphic form. He'd done this very, very detailed analysis on some literary theory, and he drew the whole thing. And she brought it home to me and said, you really need to take a look at what this person is doing. It's really extraordinary and really fascinating. And I think you would really enjoy spending time with him. And she was really, really right. Do you remember that project?
Yeah. You know, actually, if had I known you were going to talk about it, I found it recently. I can't remember where it was, but I found it recently, so I have it here. It was Jacques. I forget his last name, but
yeah, the professor.
The English professor allowed me. Excuse me, I have a loud neighborhood.
Okay.
He allowed me to do my final paper for his English seminar class as a comic. He was just like, yeah, that sounds cool. And so for some godforsaken reason, I did a 22-page comic start to finish in 10 days.
Yeah.
Take that, Jack Kirby.
Wow.
And at that time in Kurt's strategy for life, he wanted to be a comic book illustrator, predominantly interested in superhero comics. And I had always harbored the dream of publishing my own comic book someday. And because I am that person, I threw one of my scripts at him and we hammered it, or we kicked it around for a couple of years. And then Kurt said, I've got to move on with my life and I have to move to Japan with my wife. So then it kind of stopped.
I did that one short for you though.
Yes, you did a lot of things. I don't mean to diminish your contribution at all. I apologize for that. But
No.
I have to tell you, pal, I do still have them here. This envelope right here. I have all kinds of Kurt Ankeny. There's a little art hutch right over here where I have stored lots of your artwork over the years, and I do take it out and fawn over it and touch it delicately.
A little shrine and some candles are lit.
A little Kurt Ankeny shrine. Yeah. Anyway, but then you started to take a greater interest in finer arts. You kind of left the desire to do sci-fi and superhero comics behind, and started looking into painting and calligraphy and graphic design. Correct?
Yeah. You know, the thing that I think really happened was that I, you know, despite my efforts to like get into superhero comics, I think that was the only real path that I was aware of at the time. And it just sort of suddenly dawned on me that I didn't want to draw people in spandex for the rest of my life, as much as I love the human figure, but it started to seem silly to me. And so I also was, you know, having the sort of classic comic book artist insecurity about my art skills, because there was no instruction in that, like as I was coming up through my education. And so I felt like I needed to go back and reinforce that part of my education. And so I started taking some classes at the Corcoran College of Art and Design, and then I also apprenticed with a guy, which is what brought me up to Massachusetts after that.
Okay. All right. And then you started getting into this highly personal biographical storytelling, and hence and I'm assuming that's where your first book, In Pieces, came from. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, it's funny because so I had been painting for probably about 10 years at that point, and then I I started when we lost our house in the 2008 economic downturn, and we had to move to a small apartment. So we moved to that small apartment in a different town nearby. And when we moved there, it's this a very strange, like small New England town where it's a tiny place, but nobody wants to know you. Like, unless you've been there for 30 years, like they couldn't care less. And so it was an odd sensation being in the town, just in general. And I started painting these things that I would see around town because I didn't know anybody and because nobody really greeted you. I'd walk around town just going back and forth from my apartment to my studio, and I'd see these quotidian scenes that weren't really special, but when they were put into a painting, they seemed odd, or they seemed odd to me at the time. And so I started painting these things from memory. And then eventually I realized that I had several that didn't fit as paintings because they were, more narrative in structure. And so I started making comics out of those. And that's where the In Pieces directly grew out of that. It ended up being a painting series of about 30 paintings. And then in addition to that, all the comics for In Pieces. So.
And Chris, you read In Pieces, right?
Yes. Yeah. When Kurt brought him over to the Comics Dungeon back in 2016. So yeah.
Yeah. And
a lifetime ago.
Several lifetimes ago at the point.
Yeah. For the halcyon days of 2016.
So this was originally printed up in 2016, but then it's had, how many printings has it had since, Kurt?
Oh no, it's only had the one printing. It's just that Ad House has picked it up for distribution.
Oh, okay.
Which is very helpful. But yeah, we're still on the original printing.
Oh, okay.
Gotcha.
All right.
When I was looking it up again, I kept on seeing a publication date of 2020, and I'm like, am I having a seizure?
No, it's the one print job, but I think when Chris put the data in, or when Diamond does it, they just say, oh yeah, it came out in 2020 because that's when we first got it. So
Right. Yeah.
And everything in this book is by hand. And when I say that, I'm emphasizing the lettering as well. So you didn't use any digital fonts in lettering this book at all.
No, not at all.
And there were also a lot of very experimental type. I mean, it's this beautiful biography. It's like, I read this and I had the benefit of knowing you as a person already. So I got to, and it was a great trip for me because I got to catch up on the life I haven't shared with you for decades.
Right.
That's why I love this book. And so I reviewed it on the podcast years ago when it originally came out. And I did read quotes from it that particularly stuck in my heart. But I mean, I'm just one guy in the cyclone of the universe that says, well, this is why I love this book. And I don't know if that's going to translate well to other people reading it, but I still want you to read it. But yeah, that's the beauty of this book. Is it still in print? Is this one still available?
Oh, yes, indeed. It is still in print.
All right. And then you went on to and then you did a lot of short pieces that you did on different print mediums like newsprint, things like that, right?
Yeah, so I think when I came back to comics in 2014, the first couple of things I did were I had taken Frank Santoro's correspondence course out of Pittsburgh, and I did the story Saltwater Snow. The first half of that was my project for Frank's correspondence course, and then I expanded it to a 32-page book, which I put out as a floppy. And then I also found a little place here locally in Saugus that just printed up like community newspapers, and they printed up a version of A-Bomb on a tabloid side. So it was a nice big tabloid newsprint piece. So that was quite nice.
And any folks who are Patreon supporters of the Panel Jumper, you all got a copy of A-Bomb, if you recall, in your thank you for your love and support package about a year ago. So, and that was thanks to the kindness and courtesy of Kurt Ankeny. He donated those all to us. So anyway, I'm talking a lot, which is my want, but
You're just leading through the history of Mr. Charretier.
Yeah.
I am, but I'm also very mindful of boundaries right now. So Kurt, tell me about when you made this artistic transition. Did you have a revelatory moment where you said, my calling, let me rephrase this. My calling is going to be biographical stories or stories of a more speculative dint rather than superheroes.
I think what happened to me is that, I like I said about the in pieces sort of grew naturally out of my painting practice.
Yeah.
And after sort of a huge economic hit like that, one gets mopey and introspective, of course. And I think a lot of that is in pieces. I think a lot of it was, me exercising whatever damage had been done from that sort of a life setback. But also, I think it was not so much me realizing that I preferred sort of indie comics over superhero comics, but rather that, like I said, back in the 90s or so, when I was practicing to be sort of a mainstream artist, I didn't really know of any other path, or rather, the alternative path that I knew of was just so deeply alternative that I didn't see a place for myself there. In the world of like underground comics that is, Robert Crumb and stuff, I didn't see my space there. But then when I came back to comics after painting for a while, which was 2014, I found that the indie comics area had matured to the point where I saw a place for myself.
Okay.
And because the work that I had started to do in painting was expanding in its narrative scope, it just seemed to make sense to me to go back. And so that's sort of what drew me back to it, because I've always loved comics, and I had even at that point started a painting series that was going to sort of be, each painting would be like sort of a panel, and the gallery show would be a presentation of this sort of odd story. But I felt like I wanted to just go back to comics because I enjoy it so much. So,
what did you learn about self-publishing? Were there things that you learned the hard way?
I can't say that I had any like massive, lessons in the school of hard knocks. I mean, I think just in general, being in indie comics is a tough row to hoe, of course. And it's one of those games where it's a very slow burn. It's not like you're going to debut as the new Spider-Man, artist and suddenly rocket to superstardom or something. Or even, what was McFarlane's first book, some obscure like Rocket Raccoon something or not, whether.
Actually, I think it was Scorpio Rose from Eclipse, right, Chris?
I thought it was Coyote, but let's not make this the McFarlane podcast.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, but I think
at the time that was my hero, and so like it's and oh my God, how much crap I had to unlearn from that man.
Really?
At one point I was a pretty good McFarlane mimic, and I had all of his little idiosyncrasies sort of embedded in my hand, and
too many teeth in every person's mouth and everything.
Too many teeth, too many extraneous lines, too much horror vacui. Too much weird rubbery anatomy, just in general, just so. But there was something really interesting and dynamic about his artwork when it came out, and I think that was, what appealed to me. And of course, as a young artist, you don't realize that, the flash on the surface is not necessarily what's attracting you.
Right.
But I do rid myself there a little bit. Where was I?
Well, that's okay. We took a left turn at Albuquerque, but that's what we're all about. And I remember also you being deeply enamored of Travis Charese, who I thought was more of a who had a more a finer style, but still very flashy.
Yeah, he was very flashy. He is definitely like, I'm going to assume that most of his influences were European in nature. And I think at that point, like, he seemed so fresh to the American audience because there was so little Euro comics in print here in the United States. And my God, he was inconsistent. He couldn't hit a deadline to save his soul, that guy.
Yeah.
And he's still, knocking around somewhere. I mean,
he popped up recently, but like it felt like 10 years since the last time I saw him.
Oh yeah. Well, he had probably finished a panel in that time.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a good looking panel, but yeah.
It was amazing.
Go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. I don't want to completely tangent you somewhere else, but I had been catching up and going through your short kind of diary comics over on the Comics Journal. And you did those about last September. So I didn't actually realize it had been that long, but I absolutely love those. And I was wondering, first of all, like, how did you get that gig? And then B, can we maybe expect to see some more? What the experience was like.
Yeah, it was, I think it was Chris Pitzer, the head of Ad House Publishing, the head and only man of Ad House Publishing. And I think it was his contacts with TCJ that allowed me to have that space. And we had timed it so that it would sort of coincide with the week before SPX happened, because we knew that, I knew that the week of SPX, nobody's going to be paying attention to the TCJ because they're all busy packing up,
Right.
So it ran the week before SPX last year. And yeah, it was lovely. I mean, they just, gave me some very loose guidelines. And luckily we had just been on a little family vacation. So I just sort of mined that from, experiences. And I have to say it was very much in the same vein as the work that I did in Pieces, but I had changed I was interested in experimenting with that painterly style because I have been sort of interested in merging the stuff that I know about painting with the stuff that I know about comics and trying to use all of that knowledge at once. And it's a bit of a tough nut to crack because they don't get along very well, but I'm getting closer.
Nice.
Are you painting digitally, or are these practical, like actual inks or oils on canvas that you somehow take a picture of, scan, and send in or modify thereafter?
Yeah. No, everything. I try to do everything right on the paper. So those TCGA comics were, they were all done in acrylic wash on, watercolor paper, and I hand lettered over the top of them. And then I just scan it and adjust the colors basically. And I actually did them really small because I wanted to make sure that they weren't getting shrunk and that they were easily readable on a phone. So the actual originals are maybe only like 3 inches across.
Really?
Wow.
Because that's one thing that I when I was a kid growing up, I never had the aspirations to be a cartoonist or an artist, a visual artist, but I was very interested in how it was done, and I learned that artists like Gary Larson on the Far Side, their canvas was actually rather big, and it got shrunk down considerably when it was printed. And so there's just the way you have to think about the relationships, like text size and that kind of thing, just adds another element of like, I hope I'm doing this right.
Yeah, for sure. I have often tried to, I think only maybe 1 or 2 of my recent stories have been done at a size that I knew was going to be significantly bigger than what they would print at. And there's a couple that I've done recently that were actually printed bigger than the original art. A-Bomb was printed bigger than the original art, and so was Dark Desert Dawn. I have been interested in experimenting with the fact that, like, when you draw it at the size that it's being printed at, it just seems more lively. You know, when it gets, the reason that the artists in the past would draw big and then shrink it down is because you get this nice professional finish when everything's shrunk, and you get a little bit of the human jitter in the lines and stuff comes out when you shrink it down. And I'm kind of interested in that jitter being there still. And so I often will create the piece at the size it's going to be printed.
Cool.
So you kind of became your own one-man show with regards to distributing your work, and also attending a lot of festivals like Short Run, traveling around, kind of being a bit of a vagabond and selling your wares at tables. And that was a new facet I had never seen in you before, to be at these little comic book festivals like Short Run here in Seattle, and wrangling the crowds and selling your wares. How was that? Because that's not an experience I don't think that's an experience that an extrovert would embrace. And I've never seen you that side of you before, but you did a darn good job of hawking your wares there. How was that?
I don't know. Actually, the figures at the end of the day, I don't think would agree with you, but but that's because I was right next to a guy who was selling these screen prints with neon inks that were mashup of Korean anime and cat photos, and so those were selling like flaming hotcakes. And
Right.
everybody else was ignoring me completely.
You can't beat cats.
And
I also had I feel like it's just sort of part of the indie scene these days. Like you know, one of the things that's so lovely about indie comics in this day and age is that there is no gate, really. I mean, you make a comic, you show up, and if people like it, you know, or the comics community will accept you regardless. But there's your audience. Like, just go ask them to read your book, basically.
Sure.
And so that is rather lovely. But yeah, it is. I've always been sort of like, I'm one of those people that, like, I can fake it pretty good for the extrovert stuff, and I'm, you know, I like people, just not in huge doses, you know.
in torrents, yeah.
But yeah, and that's what you get at these comic shows is just torrents of people. And it's funny to watch cartoonists because we just sit there and our minds just goggle at the not, you know, it's just this you know, it's hilarious because it's a giant convention of introverts, and we just don't know how to handle ourselves.
I guess that was what the question you just answered. One of my questions was, how did you navigate all that? That's got to be a really mind-blowing process of discovery. Is like, oh, I've got to be my own salesperson, which leads me to a question I had for Chris when it came to selling independent works like Chris's. How were you advised? Because I know a lot of people would walk into your store and give you a little bit of a pitch. What were you usually looking for, and how did you advise those independent creators to better distribute and sell their work?
It just really kind of depended. We saw so many different styles and everything, and I mean, one of the key things we'd always definitely mention to people is trying to make things a little bit easier for retailers. Get that barcode on there if you can, you know, stuff like that. So there's like the little logistics, the little basics. We also would try to aim people towards, we have a local distributor, Emerald Comics distro, headed by Ann Bean, and she is amazing, and she can get your books out to all the right bookstores. So we try to make those connections as much as possible. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it just kind of depended, because we would have so many people have very finished, very, very complete, ready to go works. When Kurt brought his book in, it's just like, perfect, love it, it's good, you know. But then we get some that were, you know, don't want to be mean, but weren't quite finished by any means. And it's just kind of when you're looking at the entire display of what we had to put out there, people will ignore certain things if they're just not, if the work didn't seem to be put into them.
Are you telling me that people judge books by their covers?
Yeah,
Oh,
hey.
no, you did not go there.
So yeah, it's very, very case by case. But I will say when Cole introduced your book, Kurt, it was just kind of like, this is perfect. It's ready to go. We can feature this in so many places. We can either put it in like we have a few different indie sections. We could put it in some of the local display sections, but also it was just wow, chef's kiss. It was.
You would have just been completely tongue-tied had I handed you 120 pages of amateurish bullcrap, right? What do I say? This man, wasted $7,000 printing this garbage up.
It's one of those things where I always want to try. I tried to pick up everything that people would bring and just get a couple copies to support, and then see if anybody would pick it up. But a lot of the things that were definitely just like very beginner level, nobody ever picked up. And it's disheartening to see, but it's also just the nature of it. There's too many books fighting for space, and most stores don't have the square footage, So
Ben, it's funny that you say, like, do people judge books by their cover? One of the things, just as a consumer, that I find infuriating is if you get drawn in by a great cover and you open it up and the inside is a complete and total mismatch. There's nothing that makes me want to chuck a book across the room as much as that.
Yeah. It's the literary equivalent of like clickbait thumbnails on YouTube.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's been the nature of comics Dell Comics. They had these exquisite, Charlton had these exquisite painted covers, and you open it up and the artwork was blah. But man, that Turok cover, this is not Turok, but that Turok cover with a dinosaur or Magnus punching that robot, it was.
Well, yeah, the same can be said for Atari games from the mid '80s. The cover, the box art made them look awesome, and then it was just this 8-bit art. Kurt, when we scheduled this interview, you were kind enough to send me a box of your books.
Yeah.
Which fortunately got here before our interview today. I think I had about 2.5 hours to read, and but so I did read "Pleading with the Stars," which I want to talk about. But first off, you included this monoculture, which is, would you call this a zine or is it a pamphlet? What would you call this?
Yeah, it's a zine. Yeah, great. Sure.
From 200 Zoo Press. I get the feeling that you hang out in coffee shops a lot. Because
I have done, yes. I have done.
This book is basically portraits of other coffee or tea drinkers sitting around you. Some of them are like a very interesting, like realism style, and some other ones go into more like a line drawing, sort of abstract. It's all very interesting. There's no words, so I was able to flip through it very quickly. But I do want to ask you 2 questions about it. One, when you were you ever caught drawing somebody in a coffee shop?
Yeah, I have been. I have been definitely, like, you're like looking at somebody, you're drawing them, and suddenly they like look up and stare at you, and you lock eyes, but I have, that doesn't happen as much as you think, because I usually choose somebody that actually can't look at me, like they're either facing away or they're facing enough away that they won't notice. And usually if that does happen, they look uncomfortable enough that I just stop.
Okay.
So I stop and I turn the page and I start drawing something else. They go back to their meal, because I'm not there to bother people and I'm not there to be a creep, but it is an incredibly good resource for just keeping your skills up,
Absolutely. Speaking of keeping your skills up, so on page 14, which is actually right at the staple point of this book, There's a drawing like a woman wearing a striped shirt. There's two women sitting on a bench and like a figure of a man's face. And then I'm gonna show this on my camera in case anybody listening wants to see this on YouTube. You drew Charlie Brown. Why is Charlie Brown in this picture?
Take it back a little bit so that I can see it.
Oh yeah. So there's Charlie Brown right there.
So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and it's too blurry for me to see on this feed, but I believe if you notice, the little marks that usually make up Charlie Brown's face are actually reversed on there. And it just sort of occurred to me that like I could reverse those marks and it would still look like Charlie Brown. So.
Yeah, I just thought it was an interesting inclusion in all of these pictures of actual what appear to be actual people in actual situations.
Yeah,
it's cool. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for sending in this. And we mentioned a couple of stories from your book, Pleading with Stars, A-Bomb being one of them. Another is, forgive me if I'm flipping through the book now. I'm trying to come up with the title, and the title is Dark Desert Dawn.
Oh, yeah.
A couple of Dark Desert Dawn especially is a very bleak tale. A-Bomb, so you can find some hope in A-Bomb, but a lot of these also feel like jumping off points to larger tales. Were these always meant to be like self-contained stories, or were you start these with the expectation that they were going to become something bigger and you just had to stop, or found an ending that you liked, or what is behind a lot of these stories in this book?
I think most of them are intended to be short stories. I think they were written that way, and I'm glad you feel like they were the start of something, because that means that I'm, hopefully doing my world building and writing fairly well. But, one of the things that I have sort of been knocking about in my head is that I really envy the economy with which songwriters write, and the way that they're able to express a whole world. You take any of like Paul Simon's songs or a John Prine song or something, and the amount of like story and whatnot that they're able to cram into those 3 or 4 minutes. That's fascinating to me as a narrative writer. And I also feel like it's very much part of comics DNA, because we spent so much time either as a very short story in the comics panels, or when they finally became floppy magazines, the 8 to 16 page story was just your standard thing. And the graphic novel is great. One of the mistakes that I think a lot of modern comics does is that it follows along with the cinematic language, rather than mining some of these other things that I think are better models for comics, like poetry and like songwriting. And while there's of course a place for the sort of cinematic comic, I just feel like it's more interesting to come at it from a different angle.
Well, I love Pleading with Stars. Obviously I was very, very fond of In Pieces, but when I picked up Pleading with Stars, what did strike me was that the internal economy with which he told all of these stories, they were succinct, and there was poetic ambiguity frequently. There was, you were left with your own devices to sort of like unpack what the story was ultimately about. But there was a clarity to it. And I really felt like when I read this collection, though I'd read some of the stories before, I was like, this storyteller has come into his own, and he's found his voice and he's found his style, his narrative style. And this is going to be the best example, the earliest example of what he can accomplish going forward. So I just love this collection so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. And that's a recommendation that y'all should go buy.
Yes.
It's also like we talked about how you're very, pencil on paper kind of thing, and all the letters are hand letters, and it wasn't going to happen, but I felt that as I was touching the pages, I was going to smudge the pencil because
Yeah,
it has that
exactly.
feel to it. There are even some moments where you can tell where you sharpened the pencil, like mid sentence, and which is an interesting detail that you don't see at all in comics.
Well, I think the other thing is that one of the one another sort of like, I don't want to call it a crutch, but one of the other things that I kind of like wish to destroy in comics is this obsession with sort of high degree of finish. We've got like Charles Burns and Chris Ware on one end of the spectrum, and I love that, and it's lovely, and the skills are amazing, but I feel like there's so much more to mine from sort of artists' sketches and the quick take, and and oftentimes I will do a comic straight to finish because I want that energy of the first take in the final work. And so like Dark Desert Dawn, that was done basically straight to finish right in my sketchbook, and it was done 2 pages per page. And then I think the first couple of pages I had to go back and do a slightly more finished version because they were just completely illegible. But that one, and also the colored pencil piece in Pleading with Stars called Between December and March, that was also in the Now anthology, that was also a straight to finish. So I'm basically just writing it and drawing it as I go, and then that's it, because I want that sort of looseness. I want that sort of freshness. And as an artist, I often feel that I tense up when I do too many takes, and I don't want that. I don't want that.
There are some panels in Dark Desert Dawn where just the negative space is just fills most of the panel, except for maybe just a slight figure somewhere or text. I can't imagine how many blue pens or pencils you went through drawing that. Was it on blue paper or was it blue pens?
No, it was literally straight to finish. Like I was just going straight in with inks. So oftentimes what I would do with that, so here you can see, this is.
Oh my, wow.
Yeah. Just right there in the, so I'm not, so for these pages, I was often just dry brushing over the panel with like a very light gray tone and then filling it in carefully. Yeah, it was, I wasn't actually drawing underneath. I was just going straight, like I said, just straight to finish. Without a net.
Exactly.
And then you found yourself being a professional a hand letterer. How did that happen?
Completely randomly. I'll try and make this quick. So after I did the correspondence course, Frank wanted to run an Indiegogo. Frank Santoro wanted to run an Indiegogo to expand his correspondence course. And over the course of that, he asked me to do a version of his course in book form. So it was basically my take on his course, and then he edited it for clarity or whatever. And that was called the Santoro School Guide to Making Better Comics. I don't know if you guys have a copy of that there or not, but and in that I basically drew all the diagrams and I hand lettered the whole thing and did that. And Matt Fraction and Frank are friends, and Matt had actually contacted Frank to do the coloring at first, and it didn't work out for one reason or another. But he had seen my work on that Santoro School's handbook, and he likes hand lettering. Matt Fraction does, and so he said, oh, maybe he had seen my work, and he was like, oh, I'd really like to work with him. And then he saw my lettering, and he's like, oh, maybe he could do the lettering for this new book that we're doing.
So just to double back, we're talking about Matt Fraction and Elsa. Is it Charretier?
Charretier, yeah.
Yeah, Charretier's November, which is a 4-part hardbound series from Image. Number 2 just came out. Number 3 is
out next week on the 21st.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
For this week, actually.
And Matt Hollingsworth did the colors.
Yeah, Matt Hollingsworth did the colors. Ryan Hughes did the design. I mean, it's a killer's row, or murderer's row of talent here.
And then you have Kurt.
And you have me like puttering along in the back.
But you're credited on the cover, and so like we passed the era of letters. Well, you know what? Letters have never been given their due ever in the comic book.
No, true.
And not a lot of people paid much attention when there's Adobe took over how we did graphic design, and fonts were, there were a couple of comic book Chris, do you remember the back in the 90s there were a number of comic book letters who digitized their styles? Do you remember?
Yeah. Starkins?
Yes.
Yeah, Richard Starkins and Comic Craft. Yeah.
And but
a friend of mine made a font based on his handwriting too that he lets people download.
And so that, and I don't think a lot of people, unless you were deeply involved in the art form or were a creator, really paid attention that we went from people letterers sweating over hand lettering something to the digital. It's a big deal to me, and probably to a lot of artists, that you are actually on the cover. You are credited on the cover as the. I mean, it doesn't say letterer, but your name is there. Dude, all I really care about is you got your name on this.
It was very, very kind of Matt and Elsa to really highlight the work that Matt Hollingsworth and I were doing on the book. Of course, Matt Hollingsworth is probably my age, but he's been a veteran for. I mean, good God, he colored Preacher, for God's sake.
Is that right?
It was very kind of them, and I think you're right. I think nobody really noticed when we switched from sort of hand lettering to digital, and I also feel like perhaps it was because, especially mainstream comics lettering was seen. It has its moments for like sound effects and stuff, but for dialogue, it was basically just seen as functional, right? It's there to convey the words and maybe do a little bold emphasis or whatever, and that's about it. Be clear and get out of the way. And I feel like, at least the way I approach lettering, there's a layer of nuance and of acting and sort of character development that you can add in lettering if you're doing it by hand that would be very, very difficult to do digitally.
Yeah.
Or at least with a digital font. I mean, you could do it with a stylus, I suppose, on a digital tablet. But I think there's a whole world of stuff there to play around with, and I think that especially mainstream comics just ignored that mechanism of the comics language, and so I'm hoping to sort of bring that to people's attention if I can.
Do you think this is a craft that will come back into its own kind of vogue, sort of as a retro thing? Because hey, vinyl came back, and
I mean, I think the economics of comics would make it difficult for it to come back in any serious way, because people are just used to paying like $5 to $15 each for lettering.
Yeah.
People are just and it's done. But like it's not gone in indie comics. Like indie comics, like most indie comics are hand lettered, and yet even in indie comics, I don't think that it's appreciated for the sort of narrative vehicle that it can be, or at least not consciously. And so I try to be careful. I try to actually do as much as I can in that little.
So I do follow you on Instagram, and you had posted images of your workflow charts and graphs. So, and I was looking at your process, your workflow for your pages and your panels, and how you'd broken down your process on a daily basis. So, and what I realized is that this is an entirely different workflow process that he's adopting or at least mastering versus illustrating pages. Can you speak to that, the challenges that you had to discover while you were doing that?
Yeah, so like part of most of what I was figuring out when I was doing the lettering for November was just basically, okay, I've got this nice page of letters on a piece of paper, so now how do I get it into the digital space? Not that I don't know how to scan, but I want it, it was, there were some little technical things that I needed to get up to speed on, and that some of the production people at Image helped to, and I think Matt Hollingsworth and Ryan Hughes also pitched in to sort of give me some tips on how to make things go faster. But it's basically just, I take the paper and I scan it, and then I, in Photoshop, I prep that line work so that it can lay over the top, and then I composite it in InDesign, because no matter how well I do it on the Lightbox, there's always adjustments that need to be made once it's in the digital space. And so I have a whole separate sort of flow where I go in and I place all of the letter balloons and make sure they're lining up with the panel borders and stuff properly. So yeah, it's the actual lettering that I do is much faster than the digital process afterwards. The digital process probably takes a good half of a week, and I can do a book in probably 2 days just by hand. So.
Wow, that's amazing.
One quick question, Kurt. I noticed that you recently did a hand lettering workshop, so for Month of Mice. Have you been doing workshops for a bit now, or something you're just starting to get into, or?
The only people that have ever asked me to do a workshop are the lovely folks at Mice, and that's because I know quite a few of them. One of the co-creators, Shelley Paroline, lives here in Salem with her husband Braden. They're both stunning cartoonists, and they've worked on everything from Adventure Time to coloring all of the Raina Telgemeier books. So,
cool.
They're like these unknown heavy hitters. Like they're, they've done so much cool work, and yet, if you say their names, a lot of people wouldn't even know who they were.
Gotcha.
Which is a shame. But they're quiet folks, so I guess it suits them.
Right.
But yeah, they're the only ones that have really asked me. So I have done workshops for Mice over the past couple of years, but I haven't done anything at any other shows. Oh, maybe I did one at CXC last year or the year before. Oh, what I did was I moderated a panel with Frank Santoro's book and Kevin Heisinga's book came out that last year, and so I moderated a panel with them.
Nice.
Which was interesting because the two of them are such different cartoonists, but it was fun, and they're good guys. So,
what type of creators are you seeing taking these workshops with you?
Well, this last one for Mice, we can't really see who's there, but the Mice people had sort of back end information, and they also sort of pitched it as an intermediate to advanced course, because I wanted to talk about some more nuanced stuff, and so I think they were pitching it towards college students, so high school college students, and we got quite a few of those, and I think we got quite a few people past that age as well. So it was interesting to see.
Nice.
Seemed well accepted.
Cool.
Well received.
Well, as we come near the end of our conversation today, Kurt, do you have anything coming up? I heard that November was a 4-part series, so volume 3. When does November volume 3 come out?
So volume 3 comes out on the 21st, which is this Wednesday, I believe. And we I have to start uploading the final files for November 4 tonight. And that will be out in February of 2021.
Okay.
And then it's, now that I've sort of wrapped up many, many little freelance jobs, I am going to get back to the grindstone and do some painting and try and come up with a new book. So to be determined as to when that will come out, but I'll keep you guys posted.
All right.
Please.
Cool. Any other questions from either Cole or Chris here?
I just wanted to, I did want to pick up something I've had sitting on the floor here, and I've been scooting the cat away from it.
It's the cat. He's talking about the cat.
Yes. Yeah. So here is an illustration that Kurt did for me a number of years ago, probably 10 years ago. I wrote a poem inspired by the Fortean Times and all the weird stuff in Fortean Times. And I said, can you draw me a picture to go with this? Because I plan to publish the poem with Kurt's artwork. And, guess who never followed through on that? Anyway, but it's like, you can see that there's like a lake monster and a gray alien and a very lean and athletic looking Sasquatch there. And then, of course, the black helicopters.
Mm-hmm. Unmarked black helicopter.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's great. That was fun.
I really need to. This is from 2005, Kurt. It's a while.
Yeah. Wow, that's like 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Anyways, so I need to share that. I won't haul out all of your old artwork that I've had for 30 years.
Just remember,
we won't do that.
All right. So, Kurt, if people want to find out more about you, do you have a website? Do you have, we mentioned an Instagram. How should people connect with you?
Yeah, I do. I'm very easy to find on the internet. I am Kurt Ankeny, Ankeny, and Kurt with a K. Everywhere, Instagram, Twitter, and my website is kurtankeny.com. It makes you easier to find, folks, if you're using your name.
Indeed.
It's true.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kurt,
for the day.
Exactly. Pro tip for the day. I think he may have frozen again, but this is a good time to tell you that the Perfect Bound podcast is brought to you by the Panel Jumper. See everything Cole Hornaday and I do at thepaneljumper.com. And send us an email, perfectboundpodcast@gmail.com. And subscribe to us on iTunes or however you get your podcasts at perfectboundpodcast.com. Kurt, once again.
Let's direct people to where they can find Chris as well.
And to find everything that Chris Casso is doing,
trustyhenchman.com.
Trusty henchman, not henchmen.
Yeah.
Single henchman. All right.
Singular. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you once again, Kurt, for joining us, and we will see you next time.
My pleasure.
Thanks.